I want to welcome everybody today for what we hope is going to be a stimulating conversation. We're here to discuss the past, present, and future of violence. Understanding violence, that is to say, how to prevent and reduce it, is probably one of the most important issues facing us in this turbulent, volatile, and divided world of ours. The good news is that an enormous amount of scientific research has gone into helping us understand its causes and consequences. There's also a vast and growing body of research and set of impact evaluations helping us understand what works and what doesn't to diminish violence in the short and long term. The study of violence has attracted its fair share of ists and ers. If you think about it, on this call alone, we have political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, criminologists, neurologists, epidemiologists, along with legal scholars, demographers, geographers, philosophers, and more. One of the most dedicated students of violence was the late Andy Mack. He, in a way, defies this group of ists and ers. He was, above all else, someone who embraced life and lived it to its fullest. Let me just briefly count the ways. Andy was a professional ski instructor, a meteorologist with the British Antarctic Survey. He was a diamond prospector in Sierra Leone. He sailed twice, single-handed, between Australia and New Zealand, and was a serving RAF officer. But Andy was also profoundly influenced by the likes of Alistair McIntyre and Johan Galtung in the 1960s. He wrote War Without Weapons in '74, and Why Big Nations Lose Small Wars in '75, as relevant today probably as it ever was. In the 1990s, Andy was chair of international relations at ANU's Institute of Advanced Studies, and he then joined Kofi Annan's office as director of strategic planning between '98 and 2001. But it was in the 2000s that Andy set up the influential Human Security Report at UBC, and between 2007 and 21 at Simon Fraser. I first met Andy back in 2001 when he was dreaming up the Human Security Report. And I, along with, I suspect, many in this call, joined him first at Harvard, then Bellagio, and then virtually everywhere else to discuss how to make this happen. And what struck me then as now was Andy's capacity to communicate complex trends to policymakers, practitioners, scholars, and students. I was always impressed with his commitment to quietly nurturing the next generation of thinkers and doers. Now, Andy's wife, Laura, has set up a scholarship with Simon Fraser University to maintain this legacy. And there's a website to honor his contribution and impact. And I want folks to feel free, there's no obligation to contribute to the scholarship fund if you like, so we can hit this goal of ensuring that Andy's legacy lasts into perpetuity. Before we jump into the substance of today's, what's going to be an enlightening and dynamic conversation, I'd like Liv Torres from Pathfinders to say a few words of introduction, including about the goal of having violence by 2030. Liv.
Thank you so much, Rob. Welcome, everyone. Very happy to co-host this event. Andy Mack was a giant, and I'm very glad that we can join together to honor his work and him. Now, Pathfinders has been mobilizing for a reduction in violence and for halving global violence in particular. So we're very happy that we will be launching the task force for this movement. Many of you online has been working in parallel and with us on this goal. And we will be launching the task force next week, 21st September, on Peace One Day. We're also very happy that the Secretary General has set out a very ambitious peace agenda and endorsing the halving global violence goal in his common agenda. Now, I'm not going to take up more of your time. I want to hand it back to you, Rob. Very, very happy about this event and looking forward to the discussions. The people online here that will take part in this are the brains, many of the brains that will be part of forming the strategy for the halving global violence movement in the future. So I look forward to this. Back to you, Rob.
Thanks so much, Liv. As everyone on this call knows, and many of whom are experienced practitioners and thinkers and doers, violence is a truly a vast canvas. In its most spectacular and visible form, there are deaths, injuries, and displacement occurring during wars and conflict. Yet, as many people know, far more people are dying and experiencing pain and suffering away from the media glare due to state violence, intentional homicide, intimate partner violence, and even suicide. Violence also has complex motivations. Some social scientists have focused on the global war on terror, on extremist violence and triggers for revolution, insurgency, and political movements, while others have focused on social and economic and demographic factors shaping criminal violence, sexual violence, violence against children, and self-directed harm. While violence remains a threat and a real challenge, which explains why I think many of us are on this call, there has been progress. We've actually seen rates of conflict violence decline since the middle of the 20th century, and homicide rates have steadily declined over the past couple of hundred years. International support for conflict prevention, human rights, and peace building, while far from ideal, has actually grown in recent decades. For the first time, we have the UN commitment to reducing violence everywhere in Sustainable Development Goal 16. And while not fully respected, we have a ban on nuclear weapons, an international arms trade treaty, and prohibitions on the use of landmines. And as of last week, we have a new common agenda set out by the Secretary General, which signals a commitment to setting up a new agenda for peace with the goal of halving violence. But obviously now is not the time for complacency. Storm clouds are gathering over US and China. We're seeing continued tension across the Asias, not to mention unrelenting violence in Latin America. And as we struggle to make sense of the past, the future looks far from certain. Deteriorating international cooperation, deepening inequality, climate change, accelerating digital transformation, they're all going to play a role in what happens next. And we have a phenomenal cast of panelists to help us navigate these really tricky issues. We're joined today by Rachel Kleinfeld, Steve Pinker, Clionadh Raleigh, and Dan Smith, all of whom are titans in this field and need no introduction, and who have devoted large portions of their life to studying these phenomena. And Gary and I and Liv, on behalf of our organizations, but also on behalf of ACLED, SFU, SIPRI, and others, we're really grateful for all of you joining us today. We're going to divide our conversation into three parts: the past, the present, and the future. So I suggest we just get started right now. I want to start, first of all, in the past. It's been 15 years since Andy's first human security report was launched. And in it, he described how, for the most part, wars and war-related deaths have declined since the Second World War. Is the 75-year decline in armed conflict a fluke, or is this part of a longer-term trend? And I want to direct this question first to Steve, with Rachel to provide a quick reaction.
Thanks, Robert. It's a question I have devoted a lot of thought to ever since Andy sent me the first human security brief in 2007 in response to a blog post that I had made. And in it, there was a graph that really blew my mind. This was his stacked layer graph showing battle deaths from 1946 to 2006. And as you can see, there is a bumpy but unmistakable decline from almost 700,000 battle deaths a year during the height of the Korean War to about 20 or 30,000 in the year that he published the report. Now, we all see there are a number of ups and downs. There's clearly not a monotonic, to say nothing of a linear decline. And it does raise the question, are we just looking at a lull in what's fundamentally a noisy data series? So that's the question I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on. Is the long piece a statistical fluke? A question I've had to deal with in The Better Angels of Our Nature and in everything that I've written since then. I suspect not, and I'm going to give some reasons to believe that it is not, that there really is something going on, as Andy himself argued in 2007. One is, I'm using pre-registered in scare quotes. So some of you probably know that in science, the new state of the art is to lay out your predictions a priori, so that there isn't any monkey business in choosing the data analysis technique after you know what the data are to try to massage them to come out the way you want. So the question is, did Andy and the rest of us who took Andy seriously just capitalize after the fact once we saw this lull in the data? And the answer is, I think, no, that well before the human security brief and these data, which I should, by the way, I should acknowledge come from a composite of the PRIO data set up through 1989 and the UCDP data set thereafter. But already in the 1980s, there were lots of people who just looked more qualitatively at the state of war and had noticed that something is going on. So, for example, in 1988, Robert Jervis wrote, "The most striking characteristic of the post-war period is just that. can be called post-war because the major powers have not fought each other since 1945. Such a lengthy period of peace among the most powerful states is unprecedented. So that was 1980, before there were any data like this. And he was one of many. Werner Levy wrote a book, The Coming End of War, in 1981. John Gaddis, The Long Peace, 1986. Kalevi Holsti, The Horsemen of the Apocalypse, At the Gate, Detour to Retreating, 86. The Blunted Sword, 1988, Evan Luard. John Mueller, Repeat from Doomsday, 1989. Of course, Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, 1989. And James Lee Ray, The Abolition of Slavery and the End of International War, 1989. So data stretching up to 2006, showing that the phenomena that they had paid attention to then appeared to be continuing when it could be documented quantitatively, which they could not do, gives us a little bit of confidence that that something is real is going on and doesn't just consist of looking at the most recent data and over-interpreting it. Second is what's happened since the human security brief, since the data from 2006. And every year I go to the UCDP website to update Andy's graph. So let me show you what it looks like. Since then, I plot in Better Angels, I plot all my graphs on a per capita basis. Since population has been growing, that leads to a little bit of a decline, but very little visually. So this is over here. You can see with the last year that Andy plotted was over here. I'm going to superimpose the two graphs as best I can. So there's Andy's graph. Here is the continuation. And as you can see, there was a bulge, and indeed, Andy wrote a paper around this time. I think it was 2014, to actually a little bit, maybe 2013. What we're seeing here is mainly the aftermath of the Arab Spring, particularly the Syrian civil war. And Andy wrote a paper with a question mark, wondering whether the long peace was over. And indeed, at the time, one could wonder whether, say, if an American fighter jet shot down a Soviet MiG, or if a Soviet plane shot down the Americans, would you have the resumption of great power war when it would escalate? And that was certainly discussion at the time. Andy and I then co-authored a paper in Slate in 2014 called The World Is Not Falling Apart, where we predicted that in fact, if the choice was between a blip and a reversal, it was much more likely to be a blip. That is, that the curve would not continue to go up and reverse the decline that he had documented. And it looks like, you don't want to say fortunately, for a graph that still includes tens of thousands of verified battle deaths, but still it is fortunate that the curve reversed rather than, the blip reversed rather than reversing the longer term decline of violence. Also, there are you want converging measures generally in social science before concluding that some underlying change in the causal matrix has taken place. And so just these are some graphs from Better Angels and from Our World in Data, suggesting that it's not just the counts of battle deaths that indicate that there's been some change. For example, there's been a trend where military conscription has gone steadily down since the 1970s, from about on average from 40 countries, from about 17 months down to closer to 7 months on average. The number of men and women in uniform has declined. We don't have figures for the world as a whole, but these are from the 5 UN Security Council seats. Military expenditures as a proportion of GDP has gone down, hard as that may be to believe, and it looks like it may have asymptoted in the last 20 years, but still much lower than it used to be. Finally, and perhaps ultimately the most convincing, is a fairly new statistical technique called change point analysis. I did in Better Angels some crude statistics trying to confirm or reinforce the hypothesis that there had been a real change in the international system, just asking whether the base rate for wars prior to 1945 could predict the post-1945 distribution. And does not. It's highly statistically significant change in the frequency of wars after 1945. The problem is I picked 1945 already knowing that there was a change. Now, of course, lots of qualitative things happened in 1945 that could legitimate it as a break point. So it wasn't completely post hoc, but still a skeptic could say, yeah, you picked 1945 because that's when you knew that, that the rate of wars had changed. So ideally, you'd want a statistical technique that was completely innocent, completely agnostic to any year. And instead of picking a year and comparing the rates pre and post, would actually scan a long data series and see if there are any points at which one could infer with some statistical confidence that the underlying rate had changed. Tricky for a number of reasons, not least the fact that wars are power law distributed. So a couple of big wars can swamp the battle deaths from lots and lots of little wars. But just in the last year, 2 independent analyses have been published. Let me just give you the image of the first page. One of them was in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society by Brennan Fagan, Marina Knight, Neil Mackay, and Jamie Wood, change point analysis and historical battle deaths. And I have highlighted the money line, which is we demonstrate the existence of changes, independent data presentation in the early mid 19th century after the Congress of Vienna, in the early mid 20th century, bracketing the world wars, and the late 20th century as the world reconfigured around the end of the Cold War. Now, of course, one of those changes prior to the world wars was the rate zooming up, but then another one was after the world wars, the rate sinking, plus a second decline, what I call the new peace, and again, based on Andy's analysis and human security brief after the Cold War, where there seemed to be a further decline in the incidence of war. The other one is from a Norwegian group, appeared in the Journal of Peace Research, Statistical Sightings of Better Angels, a title that pleases me, analyzing the distribution of battle deaths in interstate conflict over time. And again, the money line is our statistical sighting of better angels indicates 1950 represents the most likely change point in the battle death series. Now, of course, there are confidence intervals around estimates of change points. 1950 in some ways might be more plausible because there's an awful lot of killing in the late 1940s and the partition of India and the Chinese Civil War. So it may not be 1946, but it does seem that something has happened. So Andy's tentative conclusion in 2007 that there had been a significant decline in war, I would say appears to be vindicated by data and statistical analyses since that came out.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. And you win points for the slides and backdrop. Strong yes in declines. Rachel, do you want to add a couple of observations from your side, please?
Sure, I'll add a few things. First of all, pleasure to be here and an honor to be honoring Andy. And I also want to know what Steve is doing with his slides and backdrop to be found out later. So I broadly agree with Stephen's stats and trends. I just want to highlight 3 intersecting trends that I think have to do with what we're seeing. And then a few caveats that I don't think change the trend lines. I think they might push the numbers up slightly, but really a blip within a larger trend. So the 3 intersecting trends that I think we need to look at here are we fighting? Are we fighting great power wars? Are we fighting regional conflicts? And are we fighting civil wars? Second, how are we fighting? What tactics are we using? And how deadly are those tactics? And third, what is medical technology doing to what the number of deaths are after we're fighting? So are we fighting? It seems that we are fighting again, but less than we used to be. So great power wars seem to be less than they used to be, although clearly there's concerns that those will be ticking up. Regional conflicts are definitely ticking up. Civil wars are definitely ticking up. However, they're still less than they used to be, as all of Steve's trend lines are showing. More importantly than whether we're fighting those at all is how are we fighting them? Our tactics are simply far, far less deadly than they were in the mid-20th century. They're enormously less deadly than they were in the 1600s, 1500s, 1200s, and so on. So there's a reason military conscription is down. It's because it's far less useful. We don't fight wars with large numbers of untrained men thrown at other large numbers of untrained men. It's just not a useful way to fight wars nowadays. Now we fight with small numbers of highly professional, highly trained individuals, often not operating on the battlefield at all at this point, often operating with a joystick, not in danger in the least, running a drone that's on a battlefield somewhere. So no even possibility of death for those individuals. So small numbers of highly trained people in set piece battles that feature 12 people, 15 people, rather than tens of thousands of people. So the possibilities of death are far lesser because of the tactics that we're using. And then finally, of course, medical technology is just head and shoulders above what it used to be. And so of the small numbers of people who are engaged in a war, far less numbers of people are dying. All of that said, I do think that we need to take some of these numbers with a tiny caveat. And this tiny caveat is this: violent death numbers don't count intimidation. They don't count other forms of death. And we know this, of course, that we're counting battlefield deaths. We're not counting civilian deaths, but nor are we counting things like civilian displacement, hunger, the sort of population stasis that a country like Lebanon is facing now. Now, I'm not going to argue that Lebanon now is what Lebanon was in the 70s. I would rather live in Lebanon now than Lebanon in the 70s. But this form of intimidation that you're seeing in, say, the Colombian countryside right now, and so on, these are precursors. They're possible precursors to future violence. And so we need to keep an eye on them. We're also seeing switches to different kinds of violence. So when you don't have wartime violence, you sometimes have homicidal violence that can mask other forms of violence, just as civil wars can mask repercussion killings that have nothing to do with war, of course. And so we're seeing switches from one form of battlefield death to potentially state killing, state repression, and homicide. But these are small caveats within a much larger trend line.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think Andy also did a fair bit of work with Les Roberts and Richard Garfield and others on issues of excess deaths, which vastly dwarf the battlefield deaths we talk about. And so when we look at the full spectrum of harms generated by these conflicts, often it's a question of how we analyze it. Dan has his hand up. So Dan, can you please perhaps offer a couple of reactions?
Yeah, sure. Maybe slightly being the dissident here. But the first thing is there isn't less war, right? The Uppsala database shows more than twice as many armed conflicts now as in the late 1940s. So the important point here is exactly what Rachel was saying, which is how those wars are being fought. In addition, here the data is less reliable, but we now know much more than we used to about what in the Uppsala database is being called one-sided violence and non-state war. And those figures are also showing an increase. And they, I think, are very much related to that atmosphere and that reality of intimidation and other kinds of violence that Rachel is talking about. I want to throw in two other things as well, which don't question the data in a big way, but just kind of look at it slightly differently. If you're taking war deaths as a proportion of population, so deaths per 100,000 people or whatever, that gives you one measure. But remember that the global population has risen approximately 3.5-fold since the beginning of that graph. So the decline is not quite as sharp. The bump at the end is somewhat higher. And there may also be detailed questions to be asking about the data, both of the last 20 to 30 years, where I think quite often there's evidence that the figures are a bit low, but also of 50, 60, 70 years ago, where perhaps the bias is slightly different. And then the other thing is just about the military spending. Yes, military spending has come down as a proportion of gross national income. Indeed, it has, and that is very, very welcome and important. But gross national income worldwide has actually gone up twice as fast as the world population has. It's gone up 7-fold since the late 1940s, early 1950s. And military spending now stands at $2 trillion, just a tad below 2 trillion. That's the highest it's been since the end of the Cold War. Yes, there's been a whole lot of good news, but I think that some of it is a bit less spectacular, and there are more warning signs within the middle of it than perhaps Steve Pinker was letting on.
Well, excellent caveats and observations, and we'll have a chance to, and Stephen will have a chance to react. But I think let's build on the point that you just raised, Dan and Rachel, around changes in tactics, changes in the nature, dynamics of conflict. I mean, there's been a lot of research, including by many of you, on the sort of transformation of political violence, including in conflict zones or so-called sort of gray zones, other situations of violence. And what we're seeing, I think, increasingly is that conflicts are expensive. Elites are using alternate means to achieve their ends. So what can we say about this transformation of armed conflict and other forms of political violence, just building on this? And I'm going to ask Clionadh to react to this, and then Dan, I'm going to give you another chance to add to your points.
Great, thank you so much, everybody. I've really enjoyed the discussion thus far, and I will say that I will miss Andy very much in all meetings that I go to into the future, in part because he was a great gossip, if nothing else. And so it was always a lot of fun to be in a meeting with him. Okay, so one of the things, though, we did diverge on was this question here about what are we missing when we talk about interstate wars and homicides? What part of the universe are we effectively making disappear so that we can focus on the statistics that are, let's say, dodgy in the least in both of those scales? And one of the things that is quite apparent is that we are missing what's happening, as Rachel mentioned, within countries where there's a tremendous amount of disorder. There's been a tremendous explosion in violent groups. And those violent groups are not trying to overtake the state. They may engage with the state, they may not. But the explosion in effectively violent labor that has occurred within developing and developed states is really something that we need to pay far more attention to, because clearly the modalities of violence that we've been seeing thus far and that we've been seeing decline thus far it could be just a manifestation of where we're looking, and we're not looking at the bulk of the political violence that's happening in states. And so basically, if I was to say what has transformed in the last few decades, I would say the form of violence. It's become not just the civil wars that we know are declining even in the last 20 years, but it's become these contests for power, because the conflict is about power. And so the agents that fight on the local level or the national level are contesting that. It's changed in scale. As I mentioned, there's been a proliferation of agents at the local level, the regional level, and the national level. It's changed in the agents. So no longer is it, as mentioned before, armies that are fighting each other on the field. Instead, it's militias, violent labor, effectively gangs in different situations that are redeployed and reused within very different political contexts. And its objectives has changed. It's about this competition that is often bounded. It's not about overtaking the state and attacking neighbors. That type of war is, as mentioned before, both costly and often drags out way too long. And so what we're seeing now is a huge increase in things like inclusion and representation within developing states, and an increase also in the violence now that elites use to contest each other for these positions of authority. And this really should make us reflect on whether or not the development solutions we've suggested for many states that are somewhat unstable are in fact feeding this cycle rather than dissipating it. I'll leave it here because I know that others will have some great insight.
Wonderful, Clionadh. Well, we'll come back to that question of the liberal interventionist project and the role of development. But maybe Dan, over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm a bit further back in the argument than that. I think that, as you said, let's get there in a bit. I think that if you look at the trends of armed conflict and open war since the late 1940s also, one of the things that about half of the wars being fought in the 50s were anti-colonial conflicts. So that is something which has shifted away in history. I think the second thing is that a lot of those anti-colonial conflicts then, in some sense, as the independent states emerged, morphed into a kind of war by proxy. You know, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's my son of a bitch. That kind of syndrome among the great powers. It's important and it's positive that there were not open clashes between the major powers, except of the kind that we saw in points in, I suppose, the 40s, the 50s, and the very early 1960s in Berlin, like at Checkpoint Charlie, and the kind that we're now seeing in the South China Sea. But it's happening between ships. This kind of macho mano a mano confrontation kind of thing. But we didn't see major clashes. But what we did see was this kind of warfare through proxies, and we've obviously seen a lot of that. I think the other really big thing to comment upon is not just that interstate war has declined in frequency, which it has done for reasons that Clionadh was discussing. I think I'm absolutely on board with that. It's also that the nature of intra-state conflict, civil conflict, has also changed in ways that she was also pointing out. I mean, talking about Libya or about Syria, one is talking about literally hundreds of different armed groups. The estimates go up and over 1,800 in Syria and up to and over 2,000 in Libya. Now, in some other conflicts, the figures are much less dramatic than that, but it is not unusual to find more than 100 armed groups. And this is not kind of North v South civil war model. This is a completely different, in a sense, war of all against all, but then the paradox is bounded in exactly the way that Clionadh was saying, with limited, my territory, my turf, my trade, my trafficking, that's what's being protected and pushed a bit further within an anarchic and violent social order. I'll leave it there and let Clionadh and others come back.
I mean, each of these topics are going to warrant, theses. So obviously we'll be skirting over some issues, and we'll have a chance to circle back. But Clionadh, you had your hand up. Did you want to react?
Thanks very much, and thanks, Dan. That was great. I think all I wanted to say is that in some ways, when we talk about conflict in groups like this, we do kind of get bogged down on one particular aspect, whether it's the joystick wars or it's the interstate wars or the statistics or the data. And I think that what the main conclusion of the last, I would say, decade of conflict research has been, is that we didn't pay enough attention to what was going on outside of these ways that we called different types of big conflicts, civil wars or insurgencies or revolutions or interstate wars or wars in general. We didn't pay enough attention to the rest. And that is now what's building, and we maybe don't have the greatest tools to explain their phenomena.
And we'll talk about tools in a moment. Steve, do you want to add a quick reaction, and then we'll move on?
Yes, I do. Since we talked about some of the trends, and since Andy was really a data guy, I thought I would just to help ground our conversation, the data that Andy himself presented. In terms of number of wars, I've unstacked Andy's stacked layer graph. I have not updated this every year as I have battle deaths. But as we see, colonial wars did peter out as colonies petered out. Interstate war kind of sputtered along at a decreasing rate, but civil wars and international civil wars. Whoops, I'm sorry, I haven't, let me just put my, let me just walk through that again. Okay, here we go. Okay, colonial wars, which ceased to exist when colonies ceased to exist, at least by the UCDB definition. Interstate wars sputtered along at a decreasing rate. And according to UCDP, there hasn't been one since the American invasion in Iraq, although there have been internationalized civil wars, and of course civil wars, which did show a huge increase up through the 80s, largely with decolonization, and then a kind of somewhat bumpy decline ever since. Again, I haven't updated this, but this would show a bit of an increase to about, if you count wars with a higher cutoff of 1,000 deaths a year instead of 25, then there's been a bit of a decline since a recent peak in 2014. According to UCDP, I think there were 6 or 7 last year. In terms of, but one point that Andy made, and I don't know how valid this still is that the transition from interstate to civil wars doesn't mean that we're just reclassifying the same number of deaths, because the interstate wars, for reasons that Rachel mentioned, have been historically far deadlier than civil wars. If you've got two massive powers chucking artillery shells and have tank battles and naval battles, then the body counts pile up a lot faster than if you've got a militia with some AK-47s. These are Andy's data for the battle deaths per conflict per year for interstate wars, for internationalized civil wars, and for civil wars. And as you can see, at least as of the 2000s, interstate wars were far more deadly, and their rate of death has come down. We talked about one-sided violence or overlaps with the category of genocide. And this is not a data from Andy. This is from Brent Valentino, but the number of states that have had mass killings has shown a pretty steep decline since the end of the Cold War. And it's much harder to get data on rate of death, but these are some data that I plotted in Better Angels from two different data sorts, Rudy Rummel and Political Instability Task Force. The data from UCDP on one-sided violence pretty much track the PITF. But there's, although one-sided killings still exist, it's certainly down from the heyday of the 40s and 50s with the Great Leap Forward, the communist takeover of Eastern Europe, then the genocide with the War of Independence of Bangladesh, the Cambodian genocide, and so on. So even the horrific Rwanda genocide is a fraction of previous ones. So again, you don't want to say that there is good news from something as horrific as mass killings or genocides, but it's the old days used to be worse.
Dan, you have your hand up. I'm assuming, Clionadh, your hand's a legacy of your intervention. So maybe Dan, if you want to, you've got 30 seconds, and then we're going to jump to the next question, if that's okay.
We don't want death by data, but honestly, the number of armed conflicts has risen to the right-hand side of the graph that Steve Pinker just showed. It's now, according to UCDP, and they're the ones who are doing the counting on a statistical, sort of a consistent basis. It's just below 60 armed conflicts. It's there's 80, which is non-state violence, and another 40 of one-sided violence. So the issue is not about the number of armed conflicts coming down. The paradox that we need to understand in some kind of way is that the number of armed conflicts has increased, but the number of battle deaths appears to have come down, perhaps not as sharply as some of these data show, but nonetheless, undoubtedly and undeniably, it's a different kind of violence that we're seeing now.
And we've talked a bit about the transformation, which is kind of where we started this particular round. Clionadh, literally the last word before we get to the next set of questions.
I'll be very quick. And just to reiterate, I mean, we have cases in ACLED where Mexico rates like warlike deaths for something that doesn't look anything like a war. Yeah. And of course, it's because it's not categorized in the exact same way that it would have been when people started counting these particular types of conflicts 30 years ago. It's adapted to its circumstance, and it's producing massive deaths.
And having worked for years now with groups like the ICRC and others who are quite disciplined in their categorization, they're struggling a lot with this so-called other situations of violence, which is this gray zone between civil war and social unrest. And I think what they're seeing is a rather dramatic spike. Let us just talk briefly. Let's move to the present for a moment. It's a fascinating conversation, and you can weave some of your additional comments into your responses. But in the wake of the sort of hasty evacuation from Afghanistan, given the chronic instabilities we're facing in places like Haiti, but also in other contexts we mentioned in this conversation, there is a growing criticism again of the liberal interventionist project. And what I think would be useful is, in spite of what, as Dan and both Steve have agreed on, which is a decline in deaths, what is the record of conflict prevention, of peace building, of stabilization, of state building in conflict and violence affected countries? And how do you see the contribution of these types of interventions in shaping some of these trends? And I want to give Rachel the chance to give us a reaction, and then I'm going to hand over to Steve for a rejoinder. And of course, as usual, everyone else will be able to weigh in.
Sure, thanks, Rob. So to look first at the past and then the present, I mean, we've had, as people have been saying, major deaths within countries. Clionadh was pointing out Mexico. I've been looking at Nigeria. These numbers are what you used to see in wars, but they're nothing like what you used to see in interstate wars. And I think we really do need to admit that. What Steve is showing in the stats is true. The numbers are just massively down from the interstate wars of the mid-20th century, but they're way up from what we're showing in the stats because the stats aren't capturing what we're seeing in modern day wars. And so what you're seeing now is this massive decline, but this real problem with how do you deal with today's wars? And this goes straight into this problem of conflict prevention, peace building, and so on. We've never been good at conflict prevention, peace building, state building. When Richard Holbrooke did conflict prevention with his mediation in Macedonia in the 1990s, Mercy Corps is trying to do conflict prevention right now with their new report, A Clash of Contagions, that shows how the pandemic is stressing systems in Colombia and Nigeria, Afghanistan. And while homicide and political violence hasn't quite caught on yet in our statistics, they're showing how all the trends are pointing in those directions. But in general, the international community doesn't do conflict prevention. We wait until a conflict is broken up. We try to do peace. And then the UN is finding that its own peace building, in fact, strengthens autocracies. And we know that autocracies might be better for homicidal violence than hybrid democracies, but they're worse for one-sided violence in certain ways. And so then you start getting into the fractal nature of violence within these countries and our problems of counting violence across these categories that I think Clionadh and I and Dan and so on are pointing out, that we have these very flawed models of how you look at peace and violence, because what we used to think of in terms of conflict prevention and so on, in terms of the nature of the state, doesn't capture the nature of the state right now. We think of states in terms of governed and ungoverned territories when there's no ungoverned territory. There are territories that are governed by perhaps groups that are not the state, perhaps conflict that is fought over between groups that are not the state, but there's no, I grew up in the far rural reaches of Fairbanks in Alaska. You can't get much more rural, and yet there are no ungoverned territories in the world. Every place is governed, and they're just being fought over. So what we need to do is have a much deeper sets of theories between how you build states nowadays, and not just between the state building in the Tilley and North Wallace Weingast ideas, because those are drawn from pre-democratic eras. And the problem with those pre-democratic eras is that we now layer democracy on top of our state building. You don't get to just build Afghanistan for 20 years. You have to build it in a democratic way. That's how the international community does things. And when you layer democracy atop state building, suddenly you have a whole new set of actors that you have to take into account. And in democracy theory, we act as if people set their violence aside. But of course, we all know that's not what happens. We know that political violence takes place through democracy. That's why we get such violent elections in places like Nigeria and so on. And so we need to take into account this electoral violence as a war by other means. And so that's, I think, what our community is struggling with right now, is how to take account this fractal nature of violence across conflict and how to look at peace building. So I would say not all is doom and gloom. There are hard situations that we've done better at. Colombia was one that we had done better at. Liberia was a peace building and state building attempt that worked surprisingly well, despite its political marketplace system. That's Alex de Waal's language that I think is very worthwhile. And so what made Liberia work better than Afghanistan and Sudan? That's a question that we should be asking ourselves. What's making Colombia work better than Venezuela, and how can we get to at least a Colombia? These are more important questions than how do we get to Denmark. In terms of peace building now, and I'll close on this, I think what we need to look at now is exactly what Clionadh was saying. The explosion of violent groups within states creates a market for violence, and a market for violence cheapens the market. It becomes cheaper, it becomes easier. And violence is often achieved through intimidation with very few bodies. If you're a journalist, it doesn't take that many other journalists dying for you to stop publishing what you might want to publish. If you're a lawyer, it doesn't take that many bodies of other lawyers for you to know who you can't defend. If you're a worker for the rights of the Amazon, you know which way your bread is buttered if one or two other human rights workers show up dead. And so it doesn't take that many for it to affect democracy, free speech, and so on, even if it's not affecting our violence statistics. That's the world I think we're in now that we need to be thinking about in terms of our peace building and state building. And so our numbers might not be rising to the extent that they were in the mid-20th century, but the effects on our geopolitical system might be just as great. And that's, I think, where we need to struggle.
Steve,
yeah,
how would you react?
Yeah, those are all very are brilliant, incisive, trenchant observations. I don't have much to add other than that, as someone who's who enjoys being surprised by data and is suspicious when people point to the present as evidence of a trend, that we always need to put into context our observations about current violence in regions governed by militias and gangs and so on, and in intimidations as much to the extent we can measure them. And the fact that they occur now does not mean they have increased. And I've noticed that that is in discussions of violence, that's a common transition. And so in all these cases, I would also like to know how much militia, gang violence, how much intimidation was there in the in the 80s, in the 70s, in the 60s, in the 50s, and which Rachel has discussed in her other work, but which just for the greater audience is something that we need to always remind ourselves, because the fallacy of something is bad now, therefore it has increased, is a fallacy. The best explanation for the good old days is a bad memory, as Henry Pierce Adams put it. And another observation is, I would love, there were data from, I think it was Virginia Page Fortna on the efficacy of peacekeeping forces, that is UN and other forces that get themselves in between warring parties. And she claimed, on the basis of statistical analyses, as of I think the early 2000s, that the peacekeeping forces didn't always keep the peace, but more often than when there were no peacekeeping forces. And I'd love to know how those data have fared in the last 15 years, and whether among experts such as yourselves, that's a conclusion that is still widely held.
I mean, I don't know all of Fortna's work. I think it was 2008 when she wrote that really important piece, and she found that peacekeeping with more robust missions tended to have a stronger impact in terms of reducing conflict. I think it was recurrence and reducing and diminishing the number of deaths in the post-conflict period. There's been work done since then by Fortna, but also others, looking also at the underlying context in which peacekeeping missions happen. It's not enough to look only at peacekeeping operations as your sole, let's call it, factor shaping dependent variables. You got to look at the context in which this is taking place. And other researchers have found that the nature of the conflict, the nature of the peace, the degree of ethnic fraction, and other variables may also play a determining role in shaping outcomes in peacekeeping operations. I don't know if others in this particular round have additional points to add, but we can move swiftly into the next question.
I just have something to add.
Go for it, Clionadh.
Thanks. I just wanted to reiterate some excellent points that Rachel made. And it was about the fractal nature of the system means that we can't use kind of these grand theories to explain why we're seeing something in Mexico and not seeing the exact same, but still equally violent Nigeria. And I think one of the things that we've noticed is not necessarily an increase, just a recognition that this is happening, which it seems like a pretty good place to start, which is that these conflicts develop around the vulnerabilities of political systems and the known fault lines that happen in domestic politics. And that's maybe why peacekeeping can be so successful, because it is geared towards a particular political system and the actors within that system. It's not made outside and everybody has to conform to it. It's applied to what is inherently going to be a very particular contextual system.
Well, let's build on this discussion a bit more then, Clionadh and Dan. I'm looking at you both, and maybe starting with you, Clionadh. If we're discussing kind of the fractal nature of violence, and the fact that the nature of conflict is changing, and that in some cases interventions can actually exacerbate the problems on the ground, what are the implications for investment in issues like fragile states or poverty reduction if conflict and other forms of political violence are not just bugs in the system, but actually a feature? So what are the policy implications of all this, Clionadh?
Well, part of that, I mean, it's an excellent question. And I think one of the things it does, not to say everything's complex, but one of the things it does is that we really need to break this notion that poor countries have conflict and that somehow increased wealth means less conflict, or increased investment is something that can only be handled by a country that is already at a certain level of development. There are many ways in which investment can, in fact, obviously reinforce some of the power structures within a state, which in and of itself could be stabilizing. And alternatively, there are trade-offs where, because modern systems, I really want to get this point because it's a little tricky, but what we see in a lot of developing states at the moment is that there's an explosion of governance, along the same way Rachel was saying. There's an explosion of governance actors locally regionally and nationally. And that's a network that needs to be fed. And if it's not fed, problems arise. And those problems are some of the reasons you find hundreds of militias as opposed to one rebel group that emerge within many states. This violence market is active. And when we see dramatic shifts in the economic fortunes of state, investment or not, what we can find is that some of those get exacerbated. That crisis, that competition becomes even fiercer. But I do want to mention that the work done on investment thus far basically says that investment without conditions does increase state violence, but it's also good in other ways. I mean, I don't subscribe to kind of the golden thread theory, which is all good things must go together, or the opposite, all bad things must go together. There are trade-offs that you make when you're investing in a state that you kind of just have to take seriously. You have to take the domestic situation seriously. It shouldn't disqualify everybody, but it needs to be considered.
Perfect points. Dan, did you want to react to that?
Yeah, I think quick comments at three levels. One is about Afghanistan. I think that if we do not learn humility out of that, then we are not paying attention. You can't go back and find a point and say, oh, look, in 2009, if they had done this different, or in 2008, if they had taken this option, or if in 2004, it's possible to start by thinking that the entire enterprise in Afghanistan, even though it wasn't all by any means motivated by bad or malign thoughts, right? I mean, you have the response to 9/11. You then ask, what do we do now that we've made the rebel bounce again in Afghanistan and broken the power, if not actually completely destroyed Al-Qaeda? What do we do now? Do we walk away, turn our back on this country? And there are good instincts which lead you to say, no, we stay. But what was the project that was being undertaken in that country? So what do you learn from that? First of all, you learn humility, but the second thing you learn is, for heaven's sakes, figure it out. Do some work, some serious work before you get into the crisis. And go back another 10 years from 2001 when 9/11 occurred, and you have in Europe the beginning of the wars in the Western Balkans. And one of the problems that foreign ministries had was they didn't have any more Balkan experts left. Ex-Yugoslavia had stopped being interesting with the end of the Cold War, and very quickly people had moved on and redeployed. By the end of the decade, there were a lot of experts, right? But the first 5 years, there'd been a kind of, I mean, name them on the fingers of one hand almost for different countries. So that's one thing that I just wanted to say about Afghanistan. We've got to learn about the importance of analyzing and understanding. I think the second thing is, yes, it's not a bug in the system, it's a feature of the system. But violence is not the only feature of either the social or the political system. So if you're looking for the possibilities of what to do, it is not just an anti-violence strategy as such that you need, it's a pro-something else strategy that you also need. And to give credit to people who were working there in Afghanistan, one of the big things there was to say, well, the empowerment of women would be extremely important. And in many ways, even though women now will pay probably a really serious price for that, that was an achievement in Afghanistan. But you have to understand that even in where we've been talking about Colombia or Nigeria, other places, there are also features of the social system, features of the culture. There are actors and players who want peace, who want social peace, who feel strongly the inhibitions that we feel against violence and so on. And the third thing that I wanted to say is that sometimes the problem that we're dealing with is that the agencies, the agents of external action that could be support, have a particular way of thinking. So of course, with the military in Afghanistan, or the military anywhere else, the military in Somalia, are we getting it right if we have a predominantly armed intervention? That's one thing. But also the development actors have got to think very hard about this, because all too often, what you get is not actually an understanding of what the social evolution is, which could be possible, which might be developed, which bits of it could be encouraged, how that could be helped. Rather, you get a kind of chronologically extended form of humanitarian emergency. When 20, 30 years later, the big actors are still doing the same thing. And they're talking about staying out of politics, leaving the space, the development space or the humanitarian space. And again, not really engaging in what the issues are and what the problems are. And, you know, as Clionadh said, it is complex. One wants to say more than just it's complex, but perhaps acknowledging complexity is the place in our heads that we need to begin.
Really great points, all of you. Humility, learn the lessons, deeper expertise, not just negative peace, but positive peace. Maybe revisit the paradigms that we've been wedded to. So all really fundamental. I want to turn now, just shift the conversation a bit to a really present concern, which is COVID-19. Early on in the pandemic, there were real fears that this would give rise, not just the pandemic, but government responses to it and the inequities and devastation flowing from it, to an increase in all manner of violence, you know, conflict, crime, sexual violence, domestic violence. The UN Secretary General, as many people recall, called for a truce between non-state armed groups around the world early on in the pandemic, which had fairly limited purchase. I want to ask Steve to start, what would you say about the impacts of the pandemic restrictions and the associated sort of development setbacks on political and criminal violence? It's a huge question. There's been a flurry of research done on this recently, but just curious if you can give us a few reactions, and I'll hand over to Rachel for also some comment.
Yeah, well, Robert, you and I went out on a limb in the very early days of the pandemic. We published an article in Politico. In fact, you and I had a bit of a discussion as to whether we should predict that interpersonal violence would go up. We went out on a limb and we said not necessarily, just based on the fact that just an informal scan of past pandemics did not show spikes in homicide in their wake. I think the prediction that it would is kind of comes from a folk theory that whenever there's anything bad, there's going to be an increase in violence, which we know is wrong. I mean, you know, probably 9 out of 10 people think that whenever there's unemployment, there'll be an increase in homicide, which we know is just not true. There isn't a kind of stress response where when people get stressed, they start to kill each other. I mean, it's much more complex than that, as Rachel of all people can fill us in. However, and I think that our hunch, I don't even want to call it a prediction, has been vindicated in that, at least in developed countries, and again, others on this panel know the data far better than I do in more middle-income countries, in more anarchic regions, and whether there have been increases, but certainly in Europe and the Commonwealth, there does not appear to have been an increase. There has been in the United States. This will be a topic perhaps we'll return to, but almost seems unlikely that it was a response to COVID. Now, I think there has been an increase in domestic violence short of homicide. Again, I don't have those data at my fingertips, and I'm eager to hear from our colleagues on this panel who do have those data. Manuel Eisner, in an article that both of us were familiar with, that you circulated, seems to have amassed the largest data set, which seems to suggest that at least in high-income countries, there was a decline in interpersonal violence in the wake of COVID, probably just because a lot of violence takes place in places like bars and public places, and when people are locked up, there are just fewer young men raising hell and likely to get into trouble.
On to you, Rachel. What are your reactions?
Sure. So I think this is a short-term good news and a long-term watch out story. In terms of my understanding of the ACLID numbers, actually, and Clionadh might have better numbers here, is that the total number of incidents of political violence worldwide has declined during the pandemic, although mob violence is up, and homicide is down in most countries, although up in America. But going back to the trends, we have suggestions that political violence might well be up when lockdowns go away. And that's because of a number of things. Kids being out of school in a number of countries has been feeding kids into these rebel groups that we're talking about. Licit economies have been shut down, but illicit economies have not been shut down. And so if you look again at that Mercy Corps report and so on, what you're finding is recruiting going up into these rebel groups of various sorts. And we know when you have multiple rebel groups that fight amongst themselves, you tend to see greater amounts of violence. You're also seeing, as we've said, domestic violence increasing. And as that domestic violence increases, kids are leaving home, and some women are leaving home, and they're going onto the streets. And so that makes them easier pickings for these gangs and other violent groups. And so the likelihood that will, as lockdowns decrease, play out on the streets grows. You're seeing declines in trust in government across the board, very strong declines in trust in government, and protest activity is up despite lockdowns. And so those are things that, and we're seeing increases in police violence against and state violence against people, although my understanding is those are pretty fuzzy numbers and not very widespread numbers yet. We just don't have the numbers, but where I've seen them, they seem to be up. And so those all suggest that you could be seeing people rebelling against the state in ways that could lead to crackdowns down the line. So, and then the last trend that I'd like to highlight is an economic one. Steve's quite right. Poor people don't just go out and kill people. I don't know why anyone would think that happens, but inequality is highly related to violence. And inequality is probably rising after this COVID situation, because we're having a K-shaped recovery where the wealthy are getting so much wealthier and poor countries are having such a lag in their vaccine uptake. And that kind of K-shaped recovery is not good from an inequality standpoint within countries. And so if we see that, because inequality is so highly correlated with violence, we're likely to see trend lines going in negative directions. So current news good, long-term news I'm not so sure, and I think it's a good call for better conflict prevention.
Interesting. I mean, I think that it's not just income inequality. Ian Golden and I wrote a piece on this a little while ago. It's other forms of inequality that we're also seeing rising between and within states, including not least digital and other forms, which are also exacerbating these divides. I think that you're probably right. And some of the data, I mean, it's still trickling in. And we've looked at this in the homicide monitor at our own institute, but that we have seen some noticeable increases in police-related violence, although for a variety of reasons, the data on that is murky, and we have a paper on that coming out today. There was a fairly large spike in reporting on sexual violence and intimate partner violence and self-directed, and self-directed violence is also another huge issue that we don't often talk about in these discussions. But issues around mental illness and suicide are enormous concerns, expanding across multiple demographic groups out of the traditional elderly area. And Thomas Apt and others, and Gary is helpfully adding some of these links, have done some interesting work also, and I've joined them a little bit on exactly that last point you raised, Rachel, about the pushback that's happening against the police, the rise of protest and the diminished trust that we're seeing, which is exacerbating potentially that state-based violence. And it's not limited to the United States. We're seeing it in many other jurisdictions. And I agree that the medium to long-term prognosis is a little more uncertain. But I want to give Clionadh a chance, since ACLED has done a lot of work on protests, and you've come out with some interesting findings on this in the last couple of months. If you wanted to throw in just maybe a few headlines from some of your work.
Sure. I will say that it was led by Dr. Kishi, so Rudabeh Kishi, and so I'm simply the messenger, although a happy messenger. So the political violence trends stayed relatively stable throughout what might be considered 3 different phases, but demonstrations obviously tanked quite significantly in the first. They did not in the second, and they have remained high ever since. I think one of the most interesting phenomena are 2 conclusions that we are at great pains to make in the piece, which is the various pieces which Gary just put up here. And the first is that COVID came upon many developing countries on top of many other crises. And so its unique effect is very hard to discern. And as I mentioned in our kind of more private chats online between us in the session, many developing countries, as concerned as they were about it, they really didn't have a lot of options about how they were going to lock down or do any of the massive changes that we might have been party to in the countries we're living in. And I suppose one of the second things is that the US is a very unique environment, but it really kind of reinforces some of these points, which is the US did in fact have the ability to do a lockdown. It also had an election, and it also had the rise of quite a violent populist movement simultaneously. So obviously oh, sorry, it's not a great case to consider, but it is, as in it's not generalizable, but it's a really interesting case for why we saw very different social trends than we would have expected, but then along the lines of what Rachel's suggesting, a decrease in government trust, a rise in kind of, especially within countries that have a lot of arms, so highly armed population, a really destabilizing lockdown and then reaction to the lockdown. And then of course, an election on top of it.
Great. I'm going to move swiftly on to another mega trend around whose discernible effects are difficult to discern when it comes to violence, which is climate change. It's on a lot of people's minds right now. And in the Security Council, as many people know, they've been debating this so-called climate security nexus for at least a decade, since 2007. Criminologists have been studying the relationships between heat and pollution and violence for over a century. I want to ask Dan, you first, since SIPRI's come out with a whole lot of work on this lately. How would you approach this topic of the relationships, if any, between climate change and, let's call it broadly, insecurity and violence? How would you break this issue down for us?
Well, I think the way that you're posing the question is the way that I would move in, how I frame this. I wouldn't talk about, to begin with, I wouldn't talk about a relationship between climate change and violence, because I know what responses and arguments and thoughts that's going to kick off in everybody. And an awful lot of the research which has been done, which has shown that there is not a connection between climate change and violent conflict, has actually been looking at the relationship between the weather and violence last year or the year before. And it's really not helped. I think the way to frame this is to think about the relationship between climate change and insecurity. And when people are talking about the climate security nexus, or they talk about the climate security mechanism in the UN headquarters, which briefs UN agencies and from time to time the Security Council on these issues, what they're talking about, half of what they're talking about, is the relationship between climate change and insecurity. And how does that relationship work? It is because climate change affects the very foundations of life and of societies. And this demands from people who have been studying international relations and international politics for years and think about interest in terms of power, which is the way that Hans Morgenthau taught an entire generation to think about it. This demands a rethink. Because if you're thinking about running international relations, international politics, or indeed the affairs of your country, on the basis of interest as understood in terms of power, that is far too, what can I say, trivial, shallow, self-defeating basis on which to run it. Humans are part of the biosphere. We are one of 1.2 million known species in the biosphere with an outsized impact. And that impact is coming home. Now, one of the interesting things which I've noted as we've been developing the ideas for this session and this discussion is this focus on the 70 to 75 year period, right? Because essentially 1950 is the beginning point of the great acceleration in terms of worldwide average temperature and the consumption of resources, of natural resources. 1950 is the period when it's no longer, is when the period begins, when it's no longer population growth that leads to the consumption of more resources. It's population growth plus increasing demand and far more sophisticated technologies for exploiting natural resources. All of this is leading us, and I won't go into all of the details because I haven't got Steve Pinker's fabulous screen and slides to show everything, and anyway, we don't have enough time. But it is leading to a completely unsustainable situation. I mean, it's already the case that about 4 billion people experience severe water scarcity at some point during the year. It's not outrageous to think that about half the world's population is going to face extreme water shortage within 2 to 3 decades from now. The population is increasingly urbanized, and much of the urban architecture that we will be living in 10 to 12 years' time has not yet been built. And it's an enormous consumption of resources to do that. All of that will also continue to feed climate change. It will continue to feed water shortages. With water shortages become food insecurity, livelihood insecurity, social instability, political instability. If you have a political system that can manage that, fine. If, in the context of what we have been talking about here, you have social and political divisions which make it hard to manage the competition, the tensions, the instabilities, the personal upheavals, the change in lives, in communities, then not fine. Then there is trouble, and the evidence does show that that trouble can go up to the level of open armed conflict, though it doesn't always. It often stops somewhere else. It finds another destination. The complexity that we were talking about earlier is kind of, how can I say, it's on both sides of the equation. There's multi-causality, lots of things feeding together, but there's plenty of possible outcomes. Multi-causality meets multi-finality in a kind of way. And the last thing that I want to say, just very quickly, is that the other side of that coin is that just as environmental degradation and focus on climate change feeds insecurity, so there is a positive relationship to be found between environmental action and the possibilities of building more peaceful relations. Because in order to undertake that environmental action, you normally need to cooperate, and building cooperation can become a useful habit. I'll stop there.
A hopeful green lining to a rather gloomy.
You kind of have to, after
you've
I'm dived into that stuff, you've kind of got to come up with the hope.
I'm with you on that. You need the balance. But why don't, Clionadh, do you want to give a few reactions to this as well? And then we're going to open it up to the group.
I'd love to. I really appreciate Dan's comments, because I think that there's two things that we don't take seriously enough, which is cooperation, which is happening far more than any sort of violent reaction to resource scarcities as people have experienced them for hundreds of years. And that cooperation is very localized, because that's often who people have to depend on, their neighbors, their friends, their community. And so we should find ways to encourage more of that. And in fact, the second thing I wanted to mention is that there's a tremendous amount of adaptation that we don't consider because we're focused on the things that we know about, whether it's political systems or economic systems. But the amount of money going towards adaptation, the adaptation plans in every country, no matter how unstable, it has an adaptation plan. And it may not be delivering on all those adaptation goals, but it has a goal to be able to reshape its biopolitical, bioeconomic situation. And I think that we should simply reinforce and help that to happen, rather than assuming it's going to be violent, which, going back to Dan's point, that really stops the conversation before you even understand what's at play and what's there to be salvaged and assisted. So yeah, cooperation, adaptation, both happening, both good.
Steve.
Yeah, I'll just build on what Clionadh and Dan said. And again, in the spirit of what Andy Mack taught us, is that we should be prepared to be surprised, and we should question a lot of conventional wisdom on the causes of violence, including that climate change will inevitably lead to war. Maybe it will, but there are a lot of reasons to think that it may not. That resource shortages either are inevitable, and a lot of predictions of resource shortages have not come true. In fact, it would be we'd probably be better off if there was a shortage of fossil fuels, but there's all too much of the stuff. There's an abundance rather than a shortage, contrary to predictions from the 70s and 80s. That the overall trends for access to clean water, for access to food, have been improvements rather than declines, because, as Clionadh mentioned, because of adaptation, because of technological advances. In the case of food security, for example, if the places in the world where farming continues to be highly inefficient adopted some of the best practices of the richer countries, then there would be possibility of adaptation to even the stresses of climate change. None of this is to say that climate change won't be a horrendous problem. It obviously will, but that we should, in the spirit of Andy, not leap to the kind of folk theory that anytime there's stress, there's going to be an increase in violence. Every time you consume something, there's got to be less of it, but to be prepared to be surprised and let the data continue to inform us.
Thank you, Steve, for bringing us back to Andy as well, and those thoughts. Really powerful contributions. We have a couple of more questions about the future, but what I'm going to ask our panelists to do is hold on to those for a second. You're going to have a final chance to speak at the end. offer a few reactions or reflections. But I want to transition to the participants, many of whom here who have contributed deeply to the field. We've had a lively discussion in the chat. Gary is DJing the digital side of things, and they're coming in hard and fast. I want to hand it over to Gary as co-facilitator to summarize some of that discussion, but also to provide maybe Gary some reflections as somebody who's been deeply involved in these conversations as one of the architects of the World Development Report back in 2011, which I think drew on a lot of what Andy had produced. So why don't you take a few minutes, Gary, and walk us through what's being discussed, and perhaps add some of your ideas to the mix.
Absolutely, thanks, Robert. I've been understudying Andy Mack here. As anybody who was at a conference with Andy knew that he would often be sitting in the back, typing furiously while also absorbing everything that was happening in the room, could immediately speak to anything we were talking about, but also was sending about 100 emails an hour to be able to continue these conversations that he had. So I've been trying to absorb what's in the chat and follow this fantastic conversation, which you've all done a tremendous job on. A few reflections. I won't obviously do everything justice. There were some great comments by Keith and Fen, I think, that are worth jumping back into, which is that we're not necessarily out of the woods on great power struggles, right? So I think reminding us about the scope conditions, which I think ties into the discussion about climate change and adaptation. What are the actual constraints that we really are? Some things can only be consumed once. And I agree with you, Stephen, not all things can only be consumed once. So this is a question of what are the scope conditions, and when are we going to run into the barriers when great power competition can be, might be resuming. But then power transition theory that Fen brought up as well. And I think this is a question about asking about, is the US on decline, and are we concerned about a change in the world order, and what do powers do when they're experiencing that? So thanks for those comments and in the questions. There were some early comments that I thought I just wanted to reinforce a little bit. We have just a quick metaphor. If the flood waters are rising and we're putting out sandbags, we noted a number of sandbags here, right? So we noticed medical tech. We're just better at keeping people alive and not having them die than more, right? But we also have noticed our institutions, the peacekeeping operations and the other institutions that we built in the world that help us to be able to resolve some of these conflicts. Those are sandbags, right? And so we're piling these sandbags up against these kind of changes in conflict and violence that we're seeing happening. Meanwhile, we do see the floodwaters rising a little bit with the types of conflict changing. They're kind of seeping around the outside of our sandbags, and we have to be concerned about these type of small conflicts, political violence between power actors struggling for power, and the kind of market for violence that both Rachel and Clionadh were bringing up. We don't have sandbags for those things yet, right? And I think we've actually, one of our sandbags is that we've gotten very good at humanitarian response. Look at the chronic humanitarian responses we have now. And we have 82 million people forcibly displaced. So if it was a country, it would be the 20th largest country in the world. If you were counting all 82 million people, it would be just behind Germany. So we have gotten very good at accommodating people that are forcibly displaced by conflict. That is a sandbag that we've created to help us to be able to manage that. And those aren't bad things. It's good that we're good at that, but we need to acknowledge that we've had to build up a lot of systems to be able to hold back some of these floodwaters. And so that brings me to the last point. And this is where, again, I'd like to tie back to Andy, which is Andy was pointing to this new piece, and with Stephen was writing about it and talking about the value of these institutions, right? These are all the things we've built. And I think Dan's point about being able to provide the vision of the possible, and Mandar brought it up as well, and talking about anti-gang work, and we all know, I think, are familiar with Cure Violence. We have the capacity to be able to respond to these kind of rising floodwaters and be able to do the work that is necessary, but it needs to be done. We need to acknowledge the complexity of these situations, the interdependence we all have, and the kind of work that needs to be done. And Andy put the human back in human security for us, right? Both figuratively and literally. I mean, he was the person architect of this. But we have to be pushing constantly forward. And so we hope that this conversation, this roundtable, is the first of many. And I hope that it will encourage us all to redouble our efforts so we don't get discouraged, that there is some hope going forward. I'll pass back to you, Rob. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. And for those who don't know Gary, Gary is the master of the metaphor. And I think the sandbag metaphor works here. And you reminded me of that image of Andy typing feverishly. That was always the background anthem to any event that I ever went to. And when I think of Andy's grand project, just to extend your metaphor, because I always try to, he was the guy shoring up the sandbags. He was the guy saying, don't lose hope, that there's opportunity, there's evidence here suggesting that these things are working. He was very worried about the impending threats, and I think he'd be extremely concerned about the last two topics we just talked about, which is COVID and in particular climate change. And I'm sure that would have been a big focus of his. I want to turn back to our four panelists, and I'm wary of not straying into people's day longer than we promised. We're to end in just a few minutes, and we might linger just a little minute or two over. But I want to give each of you an opportunity to provide some final reactions, some thoughts. We didn't talk so much about the future. We reflected a bit in the past, the present, but I'd be kind of encouraging you each in your final minute or two in your your final thoughts to maybe offer some thoughts about the future. Anything else you feel that we need to leave, that need to be put on the agenda. And I do want to sort of stress that what you're saying now is really important in light of some of the recent work of the SecGen around our common agenda and the expectation that we're going to have a new agenda for peace and a lot of the work that's going to be going into thinking about the future at the UN in the coming years. So this is a chance, I think, to think a little bit future forward and offer some final reactions or thoughts. So I want to start with Rachel to give you a minute or two.
Sure, thanks, Rob. I think I will start pessimistic and optimistic so that we can move in a positive direction. I think my training is in international relations, and when I look at the world right now, I do see the rise of Germany and how Britain dealt with it looking stunningly similar to China and the United States, especially in the economic lens. Germany was also very tied in to the international system in a way that people said it couldn't and wouldn't make war. I think the likelihood of war in the next two decades with China is extremely likely, and then we're back in the great power war situation. And to talk about the sandbags that Gary is talking about so beautifully, the best sandbag there is deterrence. And that would require Europe to be on the same page on a deterrent scale as America is, and Europe is not in that mindset right now. America is feeling pretty hawkish, and Europe is not, and NATO is being deeply undermined right now by Russia, and it's got a bunch of fifth columns, and they're growing. And so I think that the likelihood there is not positive. However, from a violent standpoint, so from a war standpoint, it's getting more likely. From a violent standpoint, I just don't see the kind of set piece war between China and the United States that we used to see between great power conflicts. When you look at the kind of military hardware they're buying, and when you look at the kind of appetite for war that these countries have, China would be willing to throw a lot of people at it, but the United States would not. And so I think what you would see is much lower numbers. In part, that has to do with the kind of weaponry, humans being increasingly out of the kill chain and the decision-making circle over the next 2 decades. That will probably lessen casualties, although the jury is out. And I also think that what you're likely to see is a somewhat dystopian spread of the surveillance technology that's allowing surveillance states, which are growing to include India and so on, to keep dissidents down. And that might lower the number of overall one-sided violence from any particular country. I don't know if you want to say that's a good thing. Is it better to have 1 million Uyghurs imprisoned than to have 1 million Uyghurs killed the way that we had during the Great Leap Forward? That's a moral judgment that people are going to have to make. And it's a hard moral call for many people, but I think that is the future that we're looking at. And as violence scholars, we need to take that seriously in our statistics, that's the sort of thing we're seeing now. And we're not just seeing it with prisons versus non-prisons, we're seeing it with whole countries that are becoming imprisoned in certain ways with this kind of surveillance technology. We're also seeing it within militaries that can't defect. And since we know that one of the big ways that you move from autocracy to democracy was through military defection, as militaries are being increasingly surveilled, they can't defect. So you're seeing lesser chances of that. On the optimism, and I'll end with the optimism, and Steve should probably be answering this, but I'll speak perhaps for him a little bit, that violence perpetuates through generations because on the political level, politicians and leaders push it. On the societal level, it's acceptable. And on the individual level, because our brains are accustomed to dealing with emotion by failure to regulate. So the political level is not looking that great. But on social acceptability, it's far less socially acceptable. And Steve has proven this over and over and over. The deep changes to the human psyche from Norbert Elias on down are, I think, extremely true. And I don't think we can even argue that the sort of honor culture and the rush to war that we saw after World War I, and this is just gone. People still laud war and toughness in very small subsets, but it's smaller and smaller. And then emotional regulation education, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, these are all things that are helping to break this individual psyche response to cycles of violence so that we're dealing with human cognition in a different way. Obviously, damage to the physical brain continues, but damage to the mind can now be healed. And so I think there's real hope that in the future we can break some of these cycles where we have the willpower to do them. And then the political causes become the absolute paramount problem, as they've long been. But we can start to deal with some of the fractal nature of violence that we've talked about that get into the individual psyche and cause it to perpetuate through generations. And that might be a path in for fighting it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rachel. Dan, why don't we turn to you with some closing remarks?
Yeah, thanks. I'm always a little bit concerned about the sandbag metaphor, actually, Gary, because I came across a very successful program on the Niger River some years back, which put sandbags to prevent erosion of the riverbanks. Unfortunately, the sand had to be taken from somewhere, and from the place where the sand was taken, the banks did indeed erode, but that was a different place, so, whatever. But I'll come back to the sandbags in a more positive way maybe at the end. I think looking ahead, I guess there's always a temptation to think that we're at an inflection point, here's a fork in the road. There's probably the whole of life and the whole of politics and all of international relations are a fork in the road. There's always the choice to be made. But I think that there is something to be saying now about this combination of the pressure of climate change, which is moving faster than was previously forecast and modeled, and the effects that that will have, which I was talking about before. The increasing number of zoonotic diseases, without making a comment on what the actual origins of the COVID-19 coronavirus really are, but it has shown what a zoonotic disease can do as it becomes a pandemic, has shown how vulnerable our societies are. And the vulnerabilities of our societies are actually quite kind of multiple and overlapping. We haven't talked about the cyber, the whole digitalization, for example. But the more cyber sophisticated we become and the more cyber dependent we become, the more cyber vulnerable we become. And the development and production of new software is fast outpacing the development and production of new security software, which by definition lags behind the front software development. So we have these vulnerabilities building up. And then we have the problems of unequal societies and poorly governed societies. And I think that in many ways, the security horizon, as you look across the next 10 years, is quite bleak. The last decade, okay, I acknowledge the good trends in general. But the last decade, we saw a doubling in the number of battle deaths. We started to see what could happen when things go wrong. We started to understand, I think, more about this kind of violent social and political orders. And that to me is where the risks lie. I must confess, and I hope this is not kind of famous last words complacency, I am not so concerned about open major armed clashes between the great powers. But I am concerned about this next level down that could indeed include open armed conflicts, but also just the spread of that Mexico type violence that Clionadh was talking about earlier. Now, in the Human Security Report in 2005, Andy's big question, right, was why are things a bit more peaceful than they were? Why has there been a decade of things becoming more peaceful? And if you remember the analysis in that report, it was like he was kind of peeling the onion. Could it be this? Could it be because of economic development? Could it be this? Could it be because of something else? What he got down to, what he was left in the onion at the end, was the role of the United Nations. And then the question that he asked, I don't think he asked this in the report, but he asked it in talks and lectures that he gave, was, well, imagine what it would be like. How would it be if all of this work for peace was properly resourced? How would it be if the politics weren't poisonous? How would it be if actually we were learning how to cooperate better at every level? And I think that is part of where, not necessarily the United Nations itself, but part of where we need to be focusing. Of course, the local, right? But also something that gets the toxin out of today's international politics and geopolitics. And perhaps that's where the sandbag metaphor comes in. The one that I would throw up there is that the sandbag is great as long as the way is prepared by constructive diplomacy. And when it's placed, it's done cooperatively and on the basis of good knowledge about exactly which sandbag to put in which place. Enough from me.
Thanks, Dan. Gary's delighted with the extension of the sandbag metaphor. Back over to you, Clionadh, and then we'll end with Steve.
Thanks very much. I never have any optimism or good news, but I will try to just say that the things that I get most worried about are very achievable, in the sense they're quite similar to what Dan and Rachel have been saying, which is I'm very worried about populism, and I see it arise in very strange places. So the phenomena, for example, in the Sahel, I'm convinced has been kind of fed by a pastoral populism because of the way in which they've had engagements with the state and the police. And that is a very attractive branding for violence that can bring together all sorts of people to cooperate towards violence, which is something that I think we should be quite concerned about. Disinformation is something that's keeping us up at night a lot. But I would say what we've done over the past 20 years in research is that we often securitize things that shouldn't have been securitized: poverty or climate or identity. And instead of investigating into these complex political circumstances that would have told us a lot more about a discrete conflict rather than every conflict, we maybe have missed some of those lessons. So my plea is that we can spend much more time focusing quite a bit more on the politics of a situation in order to be able to provide good sandbags, just to continue the theme, rather than just to presume that all sandbags work in all circumstances, which I think has been a real issue with really where large-scale conflict research suggested we were going, but really we should completely go the other way. That's what I would say.
Thank you for that. And Steve, final word to you before we
Yes.
close.
Well, and Andy Mack, perhaps wisely, made little in the way of predictions. I mean, he continually surprised us with his data-oriented take on the present and recent past. And I tend to think that if he were forced to make predictions, which as far as I know he did not make, he would advocate the same kind of mindset, namely to avoid, just as he steered us away from conventional wisdom and folk theory when it came to looking at the recent past. I'd like to think, and if he didn't, I will, that we avoid the temptation in thinking about the future to just play out scenarios in our imagination and say, well, if I can imagine it, it's going to happen. Here's a lot of things that can go wrong, and so we're screwed. Instead, to take the attitude of Philip Tetlock and Barbara Meller's forecasting tournaments, they're super forecasters, where you take into account not just your imagination of what could go wrong, but all of the factors that are pushing in different directions. Start with the base rates, see what forces you to adjust upward and downward, make concrete predictions. I've just been challenged publicly by Neil Ferguson to take on a bet that before the end of this decade, there will be a war that kills 1 million people. I'm tempted to take him up on it, although I will, if any of you out there have suggestions or as to whether this would be advisable or not. In fact, whether any of you would take the bet, I'd be very curious to know. But just, Rob, you've talked about the diverse backgrounds of the panelists. I come from cognitive psychology, and this has alerted me to a particular danger in forecasting the future, identified by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, namely that we can be seduced by fallacies of imaginability. And in the case of predicting war, for example, if you ask a lot of people, and I've tried this, how likely is it that there'll be a major war involving China? How likely is it there'll be a major war triggered by a clash over Taiwan involving China? A lot of people give a higher probability to the second, even though that's logically impossible, because war with China has to include both conflicts over Taiwan and every other conceivable casus belli. You can't have a subset that's more probable than a superset. But of course, a subset can be much more imaginable. And if we make our predictions based on what we can imagine, then the more specific it is, the higher our confidence, paradoxically, because the more specific, by definition, the less likely it has to be. That's just a trap in predicting in the future, which would call on the same kind of humility and consideration of multiple forces and attention to data and willingness to be surprised that Andy Mack recommended to us.
Really great point, Steve. I'm actually reading that book on super forecasting right now, and your idea triggers a thought, which maybe within this community, we should be setting out some questions to those concrete specific questions and see if we can crowdsource some super forecasting from everyone in this debate, but also who are participating digitally. I simply want to thank all of you, all four of you, Gary, for inspiring us with these ideas, for Pathfinders, and of course, all of the institutions that are supporting these worthy goals. We've only just scraped the surface. And as I said, these conversations are going to become more, and I'm looking forward to being able to host, as was already mentioned, future dialogues like this in the future with prominent scholars and practitioners who don't necessarily come from North America and Western Europe, but who are represented from Africa, from the Americas, from Asia, and around the world, who have extraordinary experience and ideas and research to bear. So let me just conclude by simply saying that I know Andy absolutely would have loved to have been here. These are exactly the kinds of discussions that he cherished, either while typing or after the conference, is more likely over a beer. And I think we could honor his memory by keeping these kinds of dialogues going. And I want to thank Laura Mack in particular also for the foresight, having set up a bursary in his name at Simon Fraser University. And again, would urge all of you to check out the website in memory of Andy, and perhaps if you feel so inclined to contribute. But again, thank you so much. Thank you, Boyan and Louisa and Pathfinders for providing the technical support, and of course for these fascinating and fabulous questions that were introduced in the chat. So with that, we'll close 10 minutes late, but I think it was worth it, and looking forward to the next round.